In this lecture, we're going to continue our investigation of basic cardiovascular physiology and specifically pointing to the factors that affect blood pressure. And what we're looking at here is a drawing of the transformation of our arteries eventually into veins. And we see that the actual vasculature tissue is continuous, but it just changes in terms of size and number. And we begin with the very top. We're looking at an arteriole which branches from arteries. And this illustrates blood flow from right to left. And then eventually this blood flow will move into metarterioles, which are smaller arterioles which branch at nearly right angles as that blood is entering various tissues. And that tissue could be tissue related to the digestive system, muscle tissue, liver tissue, and so on and so forth. The blood then moves through an increasing number of branches of this tissue through thoroughfare channels and eventually into arterial capillaries. And the capillaries are the smallest vessels of the cardiovascular system, so small and so delicate that these vessels allow the movement of molecules to and from the cardiovascular system and the tissues in which these vessels are embedded. Located around these capillaries are a series of circular smooth muscle rings called precapillary sphincters, and when contracted, these sphincters will regulate the flow of blood through these very small vessels. Of course, if this smooth muscle is contracted, it will decrease the size, the diameter of the vessel, increasing resistance to flow. The transition from red to blue suggests that oxygen molecules, not all the oxygen molecules, but oxygen molecules leave the cardiovascular system and enter the tissues, and at which point carbon dioxide produced by the tissues will leave the tissues and move into the venous capillaries. And so the venous and arterial capillaries differ in terms of the molecule concentrations throughout this vessel, but it's continuous with the same as the same tissue. So we see an increase in the branching of smaller and more numerous vessels, and these very small and numerous venous capillaries will eventually merge back into larger venules. And the blood here will return back to the general circulation. And so this is what is typically referred to as the vascular bed. And this is the site of molecule exchange. And this takes place in all tissues. And the molecules include oxygen, carbon dioxide, various nutrients that the tissues need to survive, as well as metabolic end products produced by the tissues that move into the cardiovascular system. So one important point to make here as it relates to blood pressure is that arterioles, metarterioles, and precapillary sphincters that we see illustrated in this drawing are the locations of smooth muscle, and when activated, that smooth muscle will increase the resistance to flow through these channels. A larger view in terms of the branching that takes place as well as the implication the branching has is illustrated in this picture. And so what we see here, we'll start with the photo, with the drawing on the upper left-hand part of the slide. We see that we have this large red artery that branches into arterioles, into metarterioles, into arterial capillaries that will then merge back into the venous capillaries and back into venules. And so if we translate this physical change to what actually happens in terms of the velocity of blood flow, we see that blood flow velocity, the speed at which blood moves through the cardiovascular system, is anything but constant. It changes as a function as the branching takes place. So the increased branching that we see from the arterial to capillary side will actually decrease the velocity, and that's what we see illustrated here. And so because of the branching, all this blood coming through this one vessel now gets redistributed and spread out. That has the effect of slowing blood flow to the lowest level within the cardiovascular system. And that is considered to be an advantage because as blood is flowing through the tissue bed, that provide the very slow movement of blood provides that time for gas, which is molecular oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange, nutrient exchange into the tissues, and metabolic end product exchange from the tissues and into the cardiovascular system. And so as those vessels start to branch into smaller and smaller vessels, we see a very steep decrease in blood flow where you can think about it through the capillaries as a very slow trickle. And then as the vessels merge back into larger vessels, the speed picks up into eventual return to the right atrium through the vena cava. And so once again here, the whole point of the branching functions to distribute blood over a larger total surface area, increasing the probability that the tissues will receive the oxygen and nutrients that it needs and will eliminate the cells of that tissue of metabolic end products. The relationship between resistance and pressure is illustrated here on this picture in somewhat. So at the very bottom, here we see the transition, the orderly movement of blood through the cardiovascular system. And we start where blood leaves the left ventricle and it travels through the aorta, which is just an extension of the left ventricle. So from the aorta, blood moves into arteries, arterioles, capillaries. That's where the branching occurs, and then the merging into the larger venules, veins, and vena cava rounds out our movement of blood from the left ventricle here on the left-hand side to the right atrium on the right-hand side. And so if we examine the pressure exerted inside these various blood vessels in sequential order, we see that systolic pressure and diastolic pressure are quite a bit different as we've discussed so far in this unit. So here we see blood entering the aorta, a very, very close reflection of the mechanics of the left ventricle. So when the left ventricle contracts, it's going to push blood out very, very quickly with a high degree of pressure. The peak here is the systolic pressure. And as that blood continues to flow out of the aorta and into the arteries, as the left ventricle is relaxing, the lowest point in that pressure, there's still pressure inside the aorta here. It's just that it's much lower than the systolic pressure. And that's the diastolic pressure. And this middle line, as you can see here, is what is called the mean blood pressure or mean arterial pressure, as we referred to on a previous slide. Now, what we see here is that there's a decreasing resistance to blood flow throughout the cardiovascular system, and that causes this continual drop in pressure as we go from aorta all the way through the system and into the venous side. And so the greatest drop in pressure is observed to occur in that transition within the arterioles. So within the arterial to capillary transition, we see that the pressure drop is very, very steep. It's very, very steep here because of that branching, and because that branching will reduce that resistance to blood flow because blood is being distributed through a larger number of these vessels. So even though the vessels are decreasing in size, the amount of blood moving through each vessel is considerably less than what we had through an individual artery. And so by the time that blood gets returned, by the time that blood gets moved through the capillaries and into the venous side of the circulation, we see very little fluctuation. And so the pulsatile nature of blood is observed on the arterial side, where blood will speed up and slow down and speed up and slow down. And by the time that blood works its way through the system and gets on the other side of the arterioles through the capillaries, the blood has a very steady flow as opposed to the pulsatile nature on the arterial side. Another important factor that regulates blood pressure is called the baroreceptor reflex. And a baroreceptor is a term referring to a sensory neuron. So now we're talking about the nervous system, not cardiovascular system. And these are sensors. These are sensors that are placed throughout the cardiovascular system that are actually part of the nervous system. And being a baroreceptor, these are sensory neurons that are sensitive to pressure contained inside the cardiovascular system. Baroreceptors are one type of sensory neuron. Chemoreceptors are another type of sensor, part of the nervous system, that are embedded through at unique places in the cardiovascular system that are sensitive to particular chemicals. The portions of the nervous system that regulates blood pressure is the first one here that we'll take a look at is the parasympathetic nervous system. And the parasympathetic nervous system operates through the vagus nerve, and this sends branches of the nervous system to the pacemaker of the heart, called the sinoatrial node. This is a small cluster of specialized myocardial cells located in the right atrium, or at the superior portion of the right atrium. And it's these cells that will dictate the pacing of the heart. And when the parasympathetic nervous system is active, it will function to reduce heart rate. This is opposite to the sympathetic branch of the nervous system. And the sympathetic nervous system operates through what are called cardiac nerves. Remember, so even though we say we have the term cardiac nerve, it's from a tissue perspective, it's part of the nervous system, and that's where the nervous system and cardiovascular system are integrative structurally and functionally. When the sympathetic nervous system is active, it will increase heart rate. So the heart will start beating faster, but the sympathetic nervous system will send branches to the left, to the ventricles, right and left ventricle, and it will stimulate the cardiac tissue to contract harder. So those muscles will produce a greater amount of force. The sympathetic nervous system will also innervate, will also send branches to the adrenal medulla. And when activating the adrenal medulla, this organ will release epinephrine and norepinephrine. And these two hormones will have a similar effect as the cardiac nerves, directly increasing heart rate and increasing the strength of the contraction. And so the activation of these neurons are all regulated through a particular region in the brainstem called the medulla oblongata. And that's where they also contain chemoreceptors. Now, what we see here in this picture, we have these unique locations in the aorta and in the carotid artery where the baroreceptors are located. So these are extensions, these are sensors that nature placed in these two unique locations. So if there's any increase or decrease in blood pressure, these sensors will detect that. And these sensors will send information back to the nervous system, where that information will get integrated and the nervous system will generate one of two responses. If blood pressure is increasing, as detected by these sensors, activation of the parasympathetic nervous system will function to decrease heart rate. If heart rate decreases, cardiac output per minute will decrease, and that reduces how much blood is moving through the aorta, thereby alleviating some of that internal pressure. What we see here with the sympathetic nervous system, if blood pressure is dropping, this is the opposite scenario. If blood pressure is dropping, these baroreceptors, these sensors will detect a less than normal blood pressure. Once again, that information will go back to the nervous system, and the nervous system will activate the sympathetic nervous system. And by activating the sympathetic nervous system, the heart will start beating faster and beating stronger, so more blood will enter the aorta, thereby restoring any particular drop in pressure. And so one thing to remember here is that the sensors send information back to the nervous system, and the parasympathetic and sympathetic branches, as we can see here, will send information to the heart and will also affect the smooth muscle, particularly from the hormones released from the adrenal gland. These hormones will regulate not just the heart, but also the state of the smooth muscle throughout the cardiovascular system, mostly on the arterial side. So this ends this part of our part one lecture on hypertension.